Hi, thank you for tuning in to Poem Praise 2. I know it's been approximately like 4 days. Certainly, I hope that peace and blessings have been upon you for those 4 days. We're going to move right along in our extraordinary African Americans. Like I previously said, our next extraordinary African American is Martin Luther King Jr., which is a civil rights leader during a time period of 1929 to 1968. And this is the information I have on Mr. King. Now, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, in 1954, Martin Luther King Jr. became a pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. A year later, Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her bus seat for a white man. Her arrest marked the beginning of King's lifelong struggle in the civil rights movement, a commitment that would bring him love, admiration, anger, and hate. Now, it would demand his courage, faith, freedom, and eventually his life. King was born in Atlanta, Georgia on January 15, 1929, and raised in a quiet African-American middle-class neighborhood. His father, the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, and his mother, a school teacher, were highly respected professionals in the African-American community. King entered Morehouse College when he was only 15 years old. Now, after graduation, he became an ordained minister and enrolled at Crozer Theological Seminary, in Chester, Pennsylvania, for a master's degree. Now, there he studied the teachings of Gandhi, the leader who struggled to gain India's independence from England. Now, King became convinced that nonviolent action was the best way to bring about change. Later, while pursuing his doctorate at Boston University, King met and married Coretta Scott. In 1954, they traveled to Montgomery, where he became pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Now, after Rosa Parks was arrested, King organized a successful Montgomery bus boycott. He persevered even after his house was firebombed in January 1956. Now, to continue the desegregation movement, King helped form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in February 1957 and was named its president. Now, guided by nonviolent philosophy and Christian beliefs, the SCLC was to become one of the dominant civil rights organizations in the South. In 1958, King wrote his first book, Stride Toward Freedom. 2 weeks after it was published, he was stabbed by a mentally ill African-American woman. When he recovered, he and Coretta visited India. Shortly after their return, the King family moved to Atlanta, where he joined his father as co-pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church. Now, in February 1960, the student sit-in movement got underway in Greensboro, North Carolina. Student leaders set up the SNCC to guide the protests, and the SCLC, under King's leadership, offered its support. Now, King also gave his support to the Corps when it began its Freedom Rides to integrate interstate buses in 1961. Excuse me. Now, in April 1963, King launched a campaign to stop segregation in Birmingham, Alabama, one of the South's most violent and segregated cities. He demanded desegregation of lunch counters, restrooms, and drinking fountains, and the hiring of African Americans by local businesses and the city government. Now, after 3 days of demonstrations, the police, using dogs, moved against the protesters. King was arrested, jailed, and placed in solitary confinement. Now, 8 white clergymen signed a statement denouncing the protests and urging Birmingham's black ministers to show restraint. Now King was dismayed. As a man of God, he had hoped for the support of the white clergy, even though their churches were still segregated. Now from his jail cell, he wrote a 9,000-word appeal to his fellow ministers. Now this letter from the Birmingham City Jail became one of the most famous statements of the civil rights movement. Now thousands of copies were printed and read by people across the country. Shortly afterward, King was released, and many of the charges against him were dropped. But Birmingham had not yet changed its ways. Something dramatic was needed to capture the attention of the nation. Now King scheduled a children's demonstration for Thursday, May 2nd. Hundreds of youngsters aged 6 through 16 took part. Before the march was over, police had hauled 959 children off the jail. Now, during the second day of the march, police used powerful fire hoses, knocked children down with water, while police dogs attacked them. Americans who witnessed the attacks on television were furious. President John F. Kennedy immediately sent 2 officials from the Justice Department to negotiate a settlement. King had 4 demands: that all downtown stores be immediately desegregated, that African Americans be hired as salespeople and clerks, that all demonstrators under arrest be released, and that a permanent biracial committee be set up. Now by the end of the week, city leaders gave in to all the demands. Now meanwhile, plans were being made for a march on Washington, originally planned to build support for President Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill. It became one of the turning points in the Civil Rights movement. Now the triumphant gathering brought a climax, but not an end, to the movement. Now December the 10th, 1964, King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. Now in 1964, a Civil Rights Act ended segregation in public places, but did not deal with the problem of voting rights. Late in 1964, the SCLC was asked to come to Selma, Alabama, to take over a voter registration drive. SNCC had begun a year earlier. Now on January 18, 1965, King led the first demonstration to the county courthouse without any incidents. Now as the march continues, however, state troopers became brutal, because on February 18th, a 25-year-old African-American man named Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed when he tried to stop a state trooper from beating his mother. Now in protest, another march took place in Selma. It resulted in a police riot where state troopers charged marchers attempting to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Now more than 140 people were injured, and in response, King invited clergy to Selma to join him on another march. Now shortly after it ended, James Reeb, a white minister, was killed. As a result of the violence in Selma, Congress passed the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which guaranteed African American suffrage. King decided it was time to take the movement north. Now deciding to concentrate on housing needs first, King moved into a rundown apartment in Chicago, Illinois. He then announced his plans to lead a rent strike if slumlords did not upgrade their properties. He also set up Operation Breadbasket to promote African American job opportunities. Now the drive to eliminate slums in Chicago resulted in promises and not much else. See, Operation Breadbasket was more successful. Faced with boycotts, a number of businesses either went out of business or agreed to hire African Americans. Now, by 1965, national interest in civil rights had begun to fade as more people shifted their attention to the Vietnam War. President Johnson, who had once supported King, turned against him after King spoke against the war. Now, many African Americans, impatient with the slow progress of the civil rights movement, were turning to violence. But not everyone had lost faith in King. Sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, asked for his help. Poor and mostly African Americans, they had gone on strike in an effort to get the city to meet their demands. So far, they had been unsuccessful. They hoped that King's presence would make a difference, and over the next few weeks, King worked to organize a series of nonviolent demonstrations to support the sanitation workers' demands. Now, on the evening of April 4th, 1968, King walked out of the balcony of his Memphis motel room where he was shot dead by James Earl Ray. Now, as the news of his death flashed across television screens and newspapers, riots broke out in American cities. Now, over 100,000 people stood outside the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, where King's funeral was held. Now, thousands of speeches were made in tribute to him, but it is King's own words that echo the loudest. And in a sermon he delivered a few months before his death, he said, "There is deep down within all of us an instinct, a drum major instinct, a desire to be out in front, a desire to lead the parade. If you are around when I have to meet my day, I don't want a long funeral, and if you get somebody to deliver the eulogy, tell him not to talk too long. I like somebody to mention on that day that Martin Luther King Jr. did try to feed the hungry, that I did try in my life to visit those who were in prison, that I tried to love and serve humanity. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice, and say that I was a drum major for peace, that I was a drum major for righteousness." All right, that does conclude the information I have on Martin Luther King Jr., a civil rights leader during the, I was going to say activist, but it's a leader, during the time period of 1929 to 1968. So please stay tuned. The next information I have for you in our Extraordinary African Americans is the Black Power Movement. All right. Holla at you later, y'all.